December 16, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. 5:30 in the morning. Private First Class Richard Brookins, 99th Infantry Division, hasn't slept in 36 hours. He's 19 years old. From Ohio. He's cold enough that he stopped shivering, which the veterans told him is when you need to worry. His fingers, white and trembling, clutch an M1 Garand rifle. The forest around him is silent. Too silent. And then the world explodes. 2,000 German artillery pieces open fire simultaneously. The largest artillery barrage on the Western Front since 1918. Shells scream through the frozen air. Trees detonate into splinters. The earth itself seems to tear apart. Brookins doesn't know it yet, but he's at the edge of Hitler's last great gamble. 250,000 German soldiers. 1,000 tanks. All hidden in the fog and forests of the Ardennes, attacking along an 80-mile front that the Allies thought was quiet. Safe. Finished. Within minutes, American positions are obliterated. Radio networks go dead. Officers scramble to understand what's happening. Is this a raid? A probe? No. This is annihilation. Through the smoke and snow, Brookins sees them. Gray shapes emerging from the tree line. Panzer tanks, their engines growling like beasts. German infantry, advancing in waves, their winter camouflage making them ghosts against the white landscape. The American line shatters. Some units fight. Some retreat. Some simply vanish into the chaos of snow and fire and screaming metal. Brookins runs. He doesn't remember the decision to run. His body just moves, stumbling through snowdrifts, his rifle forgotten somewhere behind him. Around him, the forest is burning despite the snow. Black smoke rises into the gray dawn. He doesn't know where his unit is. He doesn't know where the front line is anymore. Because there is no front line. The Germans have broken through. By nightfall on December 16th, the Nazi advance has penetrated up to 12 miles into Allied territory. Entire regiments are cut off. Thousands of Americans are surrounded, captured, or dead. At Supreme Headquarters in Versailles, the reports coming in sound impossible. Contradictory. Insane. But they're all saying the same thing. The Germans are attacking. And they're winning. This is the beginning of the Battle of the Bulge. The largest and bloodiest battle American forces would fight in World War II. A battle that would kill 19,000 Americans. A battle that would push the Allies to the brink of collapse. But this is also the story of how one man, one brilliant, impossible, half-mad general, would perform what military historians still call a miracle. His name was George Smith Patton, Jr. And in 72 hours he would shock the world. 72 hours earlier. December 13, 1944. To understand how the world was turned upside down, you need to understand how confident the Allies had become. By December of 1944, Nazi Germany was supposed to be finished. Paris had been liberated in August. American and British forces were pushing toward the Rhine River. In the east, the Soviet Red Army was crushing toward Berlin. Hitler's 1,000-year Reich was in its death throes. Or so everyone believed. At Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in Versailles, champagne corks were popping. Staff officers were making bets about whether the war would end by Christmas or by New Year's. Some were already requesting leave to go home. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces, told reporters that the Germans had been fighting a bitter defensive struggle, but lacked the strength for any major offensive action. He was wrong. Meanwhile, 300 miles to the east, in the forests and towns of eastern France, the American Third Army was bogged down in brutal, grinding combat. Their commander was Lieutenant General George Smith Patton, Jr. At 59 years old, Patton was already a legend. His tank divisions had swept across France faster than anyone thought possible. He had relieved the siege of Bastogne once before, racing to rescue surrounded paratroopers at breakneck speed. He was bold, aggressive, unstoppable. He was also, in December of 1944, deeply frustrated. Patton's Third Army was fighting in Lorraine, trying to break through the German Siegfried Line. It was slow, bloody, unglamorous work. While other armies were making headlines, Patton felt like he was being wasted on secondary objectives. He wanted glory. He wanted the final kill. He wanted to drive into Germany and end this war himself. But there was something else. Patton had studied military history his entire life. He believed he had fought in past lives as a Roman legionnaire, as a soldier with Napoleon. He believed in intuition, in premonitions, in the patterns of war that repeated across centuries. And in early December something felt wrong. The Germans were too quiet in the Ardennes sector. Intelligence reports noted increased radio silence in that area. A few captured prisoners mentioned something big being planned. But Allied intelligence dismissed it. The Ardennes was dense forest, poor roads, terrible tank country. No competent general would attack there. It was a quiet sector, manned by inexperienced American divisions who were resting and refitting after heavy combat elsewhere. Patton wasn't so sure. On December 12 he held a staff meeting. He told his senior officers something that seemed crazy at the time. He said, "The Germans are going to launch an attack. Probably in the Ardennes. And when they do, we're going to pivot north and hit them in the flank." His staff thought he was being paranoid, seeing threats that weren't there. So Patton did something extraordinary. Without telling Eisenhower, without official authorization, he ordered his staff to draw up contingency plans. Plans for moving the entire Third Army 90 degrees north. Plans for attacking toward a town that wasn't even under threat yet. A town called Bastogne. He told his officers to have 3 different versions ready. For attacking with 1 division, 2 divisions, or 3 divisions. Just in case. His staff thought he was wasting their time. They had no idea he was about to save the entire Western Front. Because 48 hours later, at 5:30 in the morning on December 16, everything Patton had predicted came true. The Germans attacked. And the war changed forever. To understand what hit the Americans on December 16, you have to go back to September 1944. To a fortified bunker in East Prussia. To a man who was watching his empire crumble. Adolf Hitler was losing the war on every front. The Soviets were steamrolling through Poland. The Western Allies had liberated France and were approaching Germany's borders. His generals were quietly discussing surrender. His own officers had tried to assassinate him just 2 months earlier. But Hitler didn't believe in surrender. He believed in miracles, in destiny, in one last roll of the dice that would change everything. On September 16, Hitler summoned his senior commanders to the Wolf's Lair, his eastern headquarters. What he told them sounded insane. He wanted to launch a massive offensive in the West. Not a defensive battle. Not a strategic withdrawal. An all-out attack designed to split the Allied armies in 2, recapture the port of Antwerp, and force the British and Americans to negotiate a separate peace. His generals were stunned. Germany didn't have the fuel, the ammunition, the men for such an operation. They were barely holding the line as it was. Hitler didn't care. He had made his decision. The operation would be called Wacht am Rhein. Watch on the Rhine. A deliberately defensive-sounding name to deceive Allied intelligence. The target? The Ardennes Forest. The same location where Germany had launched its devastating invasion of France in 1940. Dense woods. Narrow roads. Terrain the Allies considered impassable for tanks. Which was exactly why Hitler chose it. The Allies would never expect an attack there. Over the next 3 months, Hitler pulled off one of the most successful deceptions of the entire war. He assembled a strike force of over 200,000 men. 30 divisions. Nearly 2,000 artillery pieces. 1,000 tanks, including the massive Tiger and Panther panzers that could destroy any Allied tank in a head-to-head fight. All of it was moved into position under total radio silence. Troops marched only at night. Tanks were hidden under camouflage netting. Even German soldiers weren't told where they were going until the last moment. The plan was audacious. 3 German armies would smash through the lightly defended Ardennes sector. They would drive northwest, cross the Meuse River and capture Antwerp within a week. This would cut off 4 Allied armies from their supplies. The British and Canadians in the north would be isolated. The Americans would be split in half. And in the chaos, Hitler believed the Western Allies would panic. They would negotiate. Germany could then throw everything against the Soviets in the east. It was desperate. It was arguably insane. But it almost worked. Hitler gave the operation to 3 of his best commanders. Field Marshal Walter Model would oversee the overall offensive. General Otto von Manchufel would lead the 5th Panzer Army in the center. And on the northern flank, the most fanatical Nazi of them all, SS Colonel Joachim Paper, would lead a spearhead of tanks with orders to drive day and night without stopping. No mercy. No prisoners. Just speed. Hitler's orders were clear. The offensive had to succeed in the first 48 hours. Capture the American fuel depots. Seize the bridges over the Meuse. Reach Antwerp before the Allies could react. If they failed, Germany would have nothing left. Every reserve, every tank, every drop of fuel was being thrown into this attack. It was all or nothing. On December 15th, the day before the attack, German officers read a message from Hitler to their troops. It said, "Your great hour has come. Strong attacking armies are advancing today against the Anglo-Americans. I do not need to say more to you. You all feel it. Everything is at stake." At 5:30 in the morning on December 16, 1944, 2,000 artillery pieces opened fire. The largest German offensive in the West since 1940 had begun. And for the first 48 hours, it worked beyond Hitler's wildest expectations. American units were overrun. Headquarters evacuated in panic. Entire regiments surrendered or were simply wiped out. German panzers advanced up to 12 miles on the first day alone. At Malmedy, SS troops machine-gunned 84 American prisoners of war in a frozen field. It was a war crime that would define the brutality of what was coming. By December 17th, the German advance had created a massive bulge in the Allied lines. 50 miles wide, 15 miles deep, and growing. The Battle of the Bulge had begun, and the Americans were losing. The first American units to face the German onslaught had no idea what was happening. The 99th Infantry Division, the 106th Infantry Division, the 28th Infantry Division. These weren't elite troops. Some were green, fresh from training. Others were exhausted veterans, sent to the quiet Ardennes sector to rest and recover after brutal fighting elsewhere. They were spread thin. One regiment covering 15 miles of front. Foxholes separated by hundreds of yards. No reserves. No backup. When the artillery barrage began at 5:30 in the morning, it sounded like the end of the world. Soldiers who survived described it as a physical force. The air itself seemed to compress with each explosion. Trees shattered into deadly splinters. Men were buried alive as their foxholes collapsed. The noise was so overwhelming that some soldiers went temporarily deaf. And then through the smoke and snow came the tanks. German Panther and Tiger tanks. Massive. Unstoppable. Their frontal armor could shrug off American shells. Their 88mm guns could destroy a Sherman tank from over a mile away. Behind the tanks came waves of German infantry. Thousands of them. Many were veterans from the Eastern Front, hardened by years of combat against the Soviets. They moved with terrifying efficiency. The American line didn't bend. It shattered. At Losheim Gap, the 14th Cavalry Group was obliterated within hours. Troopers radioed desperate messages. "We're being overrun. They're everywhere. We need," and then silence. At Schnee Eifel, 2 entire regiments of the 106th Infantry Division, over 8,000 men, were surrounded within 48 hours. Cut off. No ammunition. No food. No hope of relief. It would become the largest American surrender in the European theater. Communications broke down completely. Phone lines were cut by artillery. Radio networks jammed or destroyed. Officers had no idea what was happening a mile away, let alone across the entire front. At headquarters of the U.S. First Army, General Courtney Hodges refused to believe the initial reports. A major German offensive? Impossible. This had to be a local counterattack. Maybe a spoiling attack to disrupt Allied plans. But by the afternoon of December 16th, the truth was undeniable. The Germans weren't just attacking. They were breaking through. At St. Vith, American combat engineers desperately tried to establish a defensive line. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division was rushed forward to hold the critical crossroads. But everywhere else it was chaos. American columns retreated in disorder. Vehicles clogged the narrow forest roads. Wounded men limped through the snow with no medics to treat them. Entire units disintegrated, soldiers scattering into the woods just trying to survive. And then came Malmedy. On December 17, a convoy of American soldiers from the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion was captured by SS Kampfgruppe Paper. Over 100 men. They were disarmed, lined up in a frozen field, and then without warning the SS troops opened fire with machine guns. 84 Americans were murdered in cold blood. Some tried to run. They were hunted down and shot. Others played dead in the snow until the Germans left, then crawled away bleeding and frozen. Word of the massacre spread through American units like wildfire. This wasn't a conventional battle anymore. The SS were executing prisoners. The rules had changed. American soldiers stopped taking SS prisoners. By December 18, the German advance had penetrated 15 miles in some sectors. The Bulge in Allied lines was growing. Towns that had been liberated months ago were now back in German hands. Civilians who had welcomed American liberators were now fleeing again, pushing carts piled with belongings through the snow, trying to stay ahead of the panzers. At Supreme Headquarters in Versailles, the staff officers who had been planning Christmas parties 3 days earlier were now staring at maps in disbelief. The red arrows showing German advances were growing longer by the hour. Eisenhower, the supreme commander, finally grasped the scale of the crisis. This wasn't a raid. This was an existential threat. If the Germans reached the Meuse River, if they cut off the northern armies, the entire Allied campaign could collapse. Fuel was the key. The German panzers were running on fumes. They were counting on capturing American fuel depots to keep advancing. If they got that fuel, they might actually reach Antwerp. Eisenhower made a crucial decision. He ordered American engineers to defend or destroy every fuel depot in the German path. Millions of gallons of gasoline were set on fire rather than let the enemy capture it. Black smoke rose into the gray winter sky like funeral pyres. But it was the town of Bastogne that became the critical point. Bastogne sat at the intersection of 7 roads. Every route west, every supply line, every path the Germans needed ran through this small Belgian town. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the offensive. On December 18, the 101st Airborne Division, the legendary Screaming Eagles, arrived in Bastogne. They had been resting near Reims when the attack began. Now they were being rushed forward with orders to hold this crossroads at all costs. Their commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, was told to dig in and wait for relief. No one told him how long he'd have to wait. By December 20th, German forces had completely surrounded Bastogne. The 101st was cut off. Encircled. Running low on ammunition, medical supplies, and food. The siege had begun. And back at Allied headquarters, generals were asking the same desperate question. Who could break through? Who could stop this? Who could turn this disaster around? There was only one man bold enough, crazy enough, to even attempt it. His name was George Smith Patton. And he was about to make a promise that seemed impossible. December 19, 1944. Verdun, France. Verdun. The name itself was haunted. In World War I, over 700,000 men had died fighting for this ground. Now, 28 years later, Allied commanders gathered here again, facing another German threat. But this time they were meeting in a cold, drafty barracks instead of muddy trenches. Eisenhower had called an emergency conference. The situation was dire. The German Bulge was now 50 miles wide and 20 miles deep. American casualties were mounting by the hour. Entire divisions were combat ineffective. The offensive had to be stopped and stopped soon, or the entire Allied position in Europe was at risk. The room was tense. Grim faces. Cigarette smoke thick in the air. Maps covered with red German advance arrows that seemed to grow longer every hour. Eisenhower stood at the front. Normally calm, methodical, diplomatic. But today there was an edge in his voice. He told his commanders, "The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster. There will be only cheerful faces at this table." It was a hell of a thing to say when they were losing. Eisenhower laid out the problem. The Germans had split the Allied front. Field Marshal Montgomery's forces in the north were cut off from Bradley's forces in the south. Bastogne was surrounded. The Germans were still advancing. Two questions had to be answered immediately. First, who would take command of the separated American forces in the north? Eisenhower made a controversial call. He gave them to Montgomery, the British commander. Bradley, the American general, was furious but had no choice. Second, and more critical, who could counterattack? Who could hit the Germans hard enough to stop this offensive? Eisenhower turned to General Omar Bradley. Bradley turned to the man sitting beside him, George Smith Patton. Eisenhower asked the question everyone needed answered. When can you attack? Patton didn't hesitate. On December 22nd. With 3 divisions. The room went silent. December 22nd. That was 3 days away. 72 hours. And Patton was claiming he could move 3 entire divisions, over 130,000 men and 60,000 vehicles, from their current positions in Lorraine, turn them 90 degrees north, march them over 100 miles through snow and ice, and launch a coordinated attack into the German flank. In 3 days. It was impossible. Bradley stared at him. Other generals exchanged glances. Someone actually laughed, thinking it was a joke. Eisenhower's face hardened. He knew Patton's reputation for boasting, for grandstanding, for promising more than he could deliver. Eisenhower said quietly but firmly, "Don't be fatuous, George." Fatuous? Foolish? Absurd. Patton didn't flinch. He looked Eisenhower dead in the eye. He said, "This time the Kraut stuck his head in a meat grinder. And this time I've got hold of the handle." Then Patton did something that stunned everyone in that room. He pulled out a small notebook from his jacket pocket. He flipped it open. And he showed them 3 complete attack plans. Already drawn up. Already coordinated. 1 plan for attacking with 1 division. 1 for 2 divisions. 1 for 3. Routes mapped. Supply lines calculated. Communications networks established. Artillery support coordinated. Everything. Ready to go. Because Patton had seen this coming. He had predicted the attack. And while everyone else was celebrating early victory, Patton had been preparing for the moment when the Germans made their last desperate move. Eisenhower studied the plans. His expression shifted from skepticism to something else. Respect. Maybe relief. He asked, "When can you start moving?" Patton said, "I already have. My staff is executing the orders as we speak." Eisenhower gave him the authorization. Official orders. The Third Army would disengage from its current offensive, pivot north and attack toward Bastogne. Patton stood up, saluted, and before he left the room he said one more thing. "Bastogne will be relieved. I guarantee it." It was a promise that would either make him a legend or destroy his career. Within an hour, Patton was back at his headquarters in Luxembourg. His staff had maps spread across every table. Radio operators were already transmitting movement orders to division commanders. The Third Army was turning north. And Patton had 72 hours to pull off a military miracle. The clock was ticking. To understand what Patton was about to do, you need to understand who Patton was. George Smith Patton Jr. was born into American military aristocracy in 1885. His family had produced soldiers since the Revolutionary War. His grandfather was killed fighting for the Confederacy in the Civil War. Patton grew up hearing stories of cavalry charges and battlefield glory. He was dyslexic, struggled to read as a child, but he memorized epic poems about ancient warriors. Homer's Iliad. The campaigns of Alexander the Great. He didn't just study military history. He believed he had lived it. Patton was convinced he had fought in past lives. As a Greek hoplite at the Battle of Marathon. As a Roman legionnaire with Julius Caesar. As a soldier with Napoleon. He spoke about these memories as if they were real, as if he had died on ancient battlefields and returned again and again, always as a warrior. His fellow officers thought he was eccentric. Some thought he was insane. But Patton's mysticism was paired with ruthless intellectual discipline. He had studied every major military campaign in history. He knew Hannibal's tactics at Cannae. He knew Frederick the Great's oblique order. He knew Napoleon's strategy of maneuver warfare. And he had spent decades thinking about one thing above all else. Speed. Patton believed that speed was the ultimate weapon. Faster than the enemy expected. faster than they could react. Hit them before they're ready, and you don't need overwhelming force. You need momentum. He once wrote, "A good plan violently executed now is better than a perfect plan executed next week." That philosophy would define everything he did in December 1944. But Patton was also deeply flawed. He was arrogant, profane. He wore ivory-handled revolvers and believed that profanity was essential to military leadership. He once said, "When I want my men to remember something important, I give it to them double dirty." He was a brutal disciplinarian. In 1943, during the Sicily campaign, Patton had slapped 2 soldiers suffering from what we now call PTSD. He called them cowards. The scandal nearly ended his career. Eisenhower privately reprimanded him and nearly sent him home in disgrace. For months, Patton was sidelined. Given a fake army command in England as part of a deception plan to fool the Germans about where D-Day would land. While other generals invaded Normandy and became heroes, Patton sat in England, seething with frustration. But Eisenhower knew something. Patton was the best battlefield commander America had. Tactically brilliant, fearless. His men would follow him into hell because they knew he would get them through it. And more importantly, the Germans feared him more than any other Allied general. So Eisenhower brought him back. Gave him the Third Army. And Patton had rampaged across France with a speed that shocked everyone. In 6 months, the Third Army had advanced farther and faster than any army in American history. They had liberated thousands of square miles. Captured over 100,000 prisoners. Patton's tanks moved so fast that supply lines couldn't keep up. His divisions ran out of fuel not because of German resistance, but because they outran their own logistics. But by December 1944, that glorious advance had stalled. The Third Army was stuck in Lorraine, grinding through the German Siegfried Line in cold, muddy, unglamorous combat. Patton hated it. He felt like a thoroughbred racehorse being forced to pull a plow. He wanted one more great battle. One more chance to prove his genius. And then the Germans attacked in the Ardennes. When Patton heard the news on December 16, his reaction shocked his staff. He smiled. He actually smiled. His intelligence officer, Colonel Oscar Koch, had been warning for weeks that the Germans were massing forces. Patton had listened. While everyone else dismissed the warnings, Patton had taken them seriously. He told his staff, "The Germans have given us a great opportunity. They've stuck their neck out. Now we're going to cut it off." Most generals would see a crisis. Patton saw a chance for glory. On December 18, before the Verdun Conference, Patton had already ordered his staff to begin drafting contingency plans. He told them to prepare options for disengaging from their current offensive and attacking north toward Bastogne. His chief of staff thought he was crazy. Disengage? In the middle of an attack? Turn 90 degrees? In winter? Patton said, "We're going to do it. Start planning." So when Eisenhower asked him at Verdun, "When can you attack?" Patton wasn't guessing. He wasn't boasting. He had already done the math. But even Patton's staff didn't fully believe it was possible. Turning an entire army, over 130,000 men in 72 hours? Coordinating 3 divisions to attack simultaneously after a 100-mile march in snow and ice? The logistics were staggering. Every division would need new routes, new supply lines, new communications networks. Artillery units would have to displace, move and set up again. Fuel and ammunition would have to be rerouted. Headquarters would have to relocate. And all of it had to happen in secret so the Germans wouldn't know what was coming. It was the kind of operation that military academies teach takes weeks to plan and execute. Patton said he'd do it in 3 days. His deputy chief of staff, Brigadier General Hobart Gay, asked him privately, "General, do you really think we can pull this off?" Patton looked at him with those cold blue eyes and said, "Hob, I don't think we can." "I know we can. Because we have to." Then Patton did something that would become legendary. He called for his chaplain, Colonel James O'Neill. Patton said, "I need a prayer. A prayer for good weather. I'm tired of these soldiers having to fight mud and floods as well as Germans. See if we can't get God working with us." O'Neill was taken aback. Patton wasn't known as a religious man. But he was serious. Patton said, I want it published and distributed to every man in the Third Army. I want 250,000 copies printed. O'Neill wrote the prayer that night. It asked for clear skies so the army could fight effectively. It ended with thy help, we shall win this battle and restore peace and justice among men and nations. Patton read it, nodded, and added his own note at the bottom. To each officer and soldier in the Third Army, I wish a Merry Christmas. We march in our might to complete victory. May God's blessing rest upon each of you on Christmas Day. Then he signed it. George Smith Patton, Jr., Lieutenant General. Commanding. On December 20th, as the Third Army began its pivot north, every soldier received that prayer card. Many of them carried it through the entire war. Some carried it for the rest of their lives. Patton believed in destiny, in providence, in the idea that great men were placed in great moments for a reason. This was his moment, and now he had to deliver. December 19, 1944. Night. While Patton was flying back from Verdun to his headquarters in Luxembourg, his staff was already in motion. The order had gone out. The Third Army would pivot 90 degrees north and attack toward Bastogne in 72 hours. What that actually meant was staggering. The Third Army consisted of 3 corps, 6 divisions, over 133,000 combat soldiers, plus another 250,000 support personnel. There were 62,000 vehicles. Thousands of tanks, half-tracks, trucks, and artillery pieces. Miles and miles of supply columns. All of it was currently engaged in offensive operations against the Siegfried Line in eastern France and Germany. Units were spread across a front of nearly 90 miles. And now, all of it had to stop, turn north, and march over 100 miles through snow and ice to attack in a completely different direction. In 3 days. Military historians still study what happened next as one of the greatest logistical achievements of World War II. The man who made it possible was Patton's Chief of Staff, Major General Hugh Gaffey, and his deputy, Brigadier General Hobart Gay. They worked through the night of December 19th with virtually no sleep. First, they had to select which divisions would make the attack. Patton chose the 4th Armored Division, the fastest and most experienced tank unit in the Third Army. They would be the spearhead driving straight for Bastogne. He chose the 26th Infantry Division, a solid, dependable unit that could hold ground once it was taken. And he chose the 80th Infantry Division, tough veterans who had been fighting in Lorraine for weeks. 3 divisions. 3 different axes of advance. All converging on Bastogne. Next came the routes. Third Army staff officers spread maps across every available table. They calculated distances, identified bottlenecks, assigned roads to specific units so columns wouldn't collide. This wasn't just moving 3 divisions. It was choreographing a dance of thousands of vehicles, all moving simultaneously on narrow, icy roads through the Ardennes winter. A single traffic jam could delay the entire operation by days. Staff officers worked out movement tables down to the minute. Unit A leaves at 0400 hours. Unit B leaves at 0430. Unit C waits until Unit A clears checkpoint D, then moves at 0600. Every bridge had to be checked. Every road had to be cleared. Military police were positioned at every intersection to direct traffic. Then came communications. Radio networks had to be completely reconfigured. Units that had been talking to headquarters in one direction now needed to communicate in another. New frequencies. New call signs. New encryption codes. Signal Corps officers laid thousands of miles of telephone wire in freezing weather, stringing lines from tree to tree so commanders could coordinate the attack. Artillery was perhaps the most complicated piece. Over 300 guns had to be displaced from their current firing positions, moved north, and set up again to support the attack. Each gun weighed several tons. Each required a crew, ammunition trucks, forward observers, and fire direction centers. Artillery commanders had to calculate new firing tables for completely different terrain and targets. And then there was supply. An army doesn't just march. It consumes fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies. The Third Army was burning through thousands of gallons of gasoline every hour. Every tank, every truck needed fuel. Patton's logistics officers had to redirect fuel convoys from the Siegfried Line to the new axes of advance. Ammunition was even more critical. Patton's divisions had been fighting for weeks. Stocks were low. Now they needed full combat loads for an entirely new offensive. Supply depots worked around the clock. Trucks hauled crates of shells, belts of machine gun ammunition, boxes of grenades. Everything had to be pre-positioned along the routes north so units could resupply on the move. Patton's Quartermaster Corps performed what some called black magic. They supplied an army in motion without letting it stop. On December 20th, the movement began. At 0400 hours, the first elements of the 4th Armored Division pulled out of their positions near Saarbrücken. Tank engines roared to life in the darkness. Exhaust smoke mingled with the frozen fog. One by one, columns formed up and began moving north. By midday, all 3 divisions were on the road. It was a river of steel and men flowing north through the snow. Sherman tanks, half-tracks packed with infantry, jeeps carrying officers and radios, artillery tractors towing guns, fuel trucks, ambulances, kitchen trucks, everything an army needs to fight. The roads were sheets of ice. Tanks slipped and slid. Trucks jackknifed. Vehicles went into ditches and had to be hauled out by recovery teams. But the columns kept moving. Patton himself drove up and down the routes in his Jeep, checking progress. When he found a traffic jam, he got out and personally directed traffic until it cleared. When he found units moving too slowly, he shouted at officers, threatened to relieve them on the spot if they didn't speed up. He was everywhere. Profane. Furious. Demanding the impossible. And his soldiers delivered. Military police worked miracles at intersections. When 2 columns arrived at the same crossroads simultaneously, MPs made split-second decisions about who went first. Sometimes they just ordered units off the road entirely to let priority traffic through. Somehow it worked. By December 21st, the divisions were in position. Exhausted. Cold. But ready. The 4th Armored Division was south of Bastogne, prepared to attack north. The 26th Infantry Division was on their left flank. The 80th Infantry Division was on their right. 3 divisions. 3 axes. All aimed at the same objective. On the night of December 21st, Patton met with his division commanders. He told them, "Drive like hell. We're going to relieve Bastogne and we're going to kill Germans doing it." At 6 o'clock hours on December 22nd, exactly when Patton had promised Eisenhower, the Third Army attacked. The impossible had become real. December 22, 1944. Dawn. The soldiers of the Third Army had been marching for 3 days. Now they were going into combat. For the men in the tanks and trucks, the experience was surreal. 3 days ago they had been fighting east, attacking the Siegfried Line, trying to break into Germany. Now suddenly they were racing north to rescue surrounded paratroopers in Belgium. Most of them had no idea what had happened in the Ardennes. They didn't know about the massive German offensive. They didn't know about Bastogne. All they knew was that Patton had given them an order. Now, fast. Private James Pemberton, 4th Armored Division, would later describe the march north as the coldest, most miserable experience of his life. And he had already survived Normandy. The temperature was below freezing. Snow fell constantly. The wind cut through uniforms like knives. Men wrapped themselves in blankets, in burlap sacks, and anything that might provide warmth. But the worst part was the waiting. Sitting in the back of a truck or on top of a tank, exposed to the wind, unable to move, just enduring the cold for hours at a time. Frostbite became as dangerous as German bullets. Soldiers who didn't keep moving their fingers and toes would lose them. Medics checked men constantly, looking for the white, waxy skin that meant tissue was dying. Some men lost fingers. Some lost toes. Some lost entire feet. The equipment was suffering too. Tank engines refused to start in the cold. Mechanics had to heat them with blowtorches just to get them running. Once running, engines had to be kept idling because if they shut down they might not restart. Weapons froze. The oil in rifles and machine guns turned to sludge in the cold. Soldiers had to strip them down and clean them with gasoline, then run them dry with no lubrication at all. It was hard on the weapons, but it was the only way to keep them firing. Even the fuel was a problem. Diesel fuel turned to gel in the extreme cold. Tankers had to mix gasoline with the diesel just to keep it liquid. It was dangerous, improvised, but it worked. The roads were a nightmare. Narrow forest tracks, never designed for military traffic, now choked with thousands of vehicles. Ice made everything treacherous. Tanks slid sideways on turns. Trucks fishtailed and crashed into ditches. Recovery teams worked constantly. Wreckers hauled disabled vehicles out of the way. Engineers used shovels and pickaxes to break up ice. Sand and gravel were spread on the worst sections, but there was never enough. And through it all, the columns kept moving. Patton had given orders. No stopping except for fuel and ammunition. No rest. No delays. Every hour mattered. Every mile brought them closer to Bastogne. At night, the march continued. Drivers navigated by blackout lights, tiny slits of illumination barely bright enough to see the vehicle ahead. It was terrifying. One wrong turn, one moment of inattention, and a truck could go off the road into a ravine. Soldiers tried to sleep while moving. Sitting in trucks, leaning against each other for warmth, heads bouncing with every bump in the road. Real sleep was impossible. They existed in a state of frozen exhaustion. Officers rode up and down the columns, checking on their men, pushing them to keep going. Battalion commanders hadn't slept in days. They stayed awake on coffee and cigarettes and sheer willpower. And everywhere there was Patton. He drove the routes constantly in his jeep, his ivory-handled revolvers on his hips, his face grim. When he found a unit stopped, he demanded to know why. If the reason wasn't good enough, heads rolled. He told one colonel, "I don't care if your men are tired. I don't care if they're cold. The men in Bastogne are dying. Get moving." But Patton also stopped to talk to soldiers. He'd pull up next to a column, get out, and walk along talking to enlisted men. Asking how they were holding up. Telling them they were doing something historic. He told them, "You're the best goddamn soldiers in the world. The Germans are scared to death of you. Now let's go show them why." It was exactly the kind of thing his men needed to hear. Patton understood that. He knew that morale was as important as ammunition. On December 22nd, as the attack began, the reality of what they were facing became clear. The Germans weren't just at Bastogne. They were everywhere. The southern flank of the German offensive was still pushing forward, and the Third Army was attacking directly into it. This wasn't going to be a race to Bastogne. It was going to be a fight every single mile. The first contact came near the town of Rambrouch. Lead elements of the 4th Armored Division ran into German positions. Machine gun fire raked the column. A Sherman tank exploded, hit by a German anti-tank gun hidden in the trees. The Americans deployed. Infantry dismounted from half-tracks and spread into the woods. Artillery was called in. Within minutes, American shells were falling on German positions. The battle for Bastogne had begun. But it wasn't a single battle. It was dozens of small vicious fights. Every village. Every crossroads. Every ridge. The Germans fought for everything. Tank battles erupted in snow-covered fields. German Panzer IVs and Panthers against American Shermans. The Shermans were outgunned, their armor too thin, but they had numbers and they had air support when the weather cleared. Infantry fought house to house in frozen villages. Grenades through windows. Machine guns at doorways. Close, brutal combat. And the casualties mounted. Men killed by artillery. By sniper fire. By mines hidden under the snow. The medics worked frantically, but there were never enough of them. Wounded men were loaded into ambulances and sent back south. Some would make it to aid stations. Some would die on the way, bleeding out or succumbing to shock and cold. But the Third Army kept advancing. 1 mile. 2 miles. 5 miles. Slowly, painfully, they pushed north toward Bastogne. On December 23rd, the weather broke. The clouds cleared. For the first time in days, the sun appeared. And with it came the planes. American P-47 Thunderbolts roared overhead, diving on German positions. They strafed columns. Bombed strongpoints. Dropped supplies to the surrounded troops in Bastogne. The soldiers on the ground cheered. They had been fighting blind, without air support, for days. Now the full weight of American air power was joining the battle. Patton's prayer had been answered. In Bastogne, the surrounded 101st Airborne heard the sound of aircraft overhead. They saw supply parachutes falling. Food, ammunition, medical supplies. It wasn't relief. Not yet. But it was hope. They knew Patton was coming. They just had to hold on a little longer. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, the 4th Armored Division was 10 miles south of Bastogne. They had fought through 3 German defensive lines. They had lost dozens of tanks. Hundreds of men were dead or wounded. But they were still advancing. That night, in frozen foxholes and inside tanks, American soldiers celebrated Christmas as best they could. Some had received packages from home before the march north. Cookies, letters, small reminders of the world they were fighting for. Chaplains held services in the snow. Men sang carols quietly, afraid to draw German artillery. And they thought about the men in Bastogne, surrounded, wondering if they would live to see another Christmas. Patton spent Christmas Eve visiting his forward units. He stood in the snow with infantrymen and told them, "Tomorrow we break through. Tomorrow we end this." It was a promise. Another one. And George Smith Patton had a reputation to keep. While Patton's Third Army was fighting its way north, the men trapped in Bastogne were fighting for their lives. The 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, had arrived in Bastogne on December 18th with orders to hold the town at all costs. They had barely dug in when the Germans surrounded them on December 20th. Now, for days later they were completely cut off. No supplies coming in. No reinforcements. No escape. The commander of the 101st was Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. He was an artilleryman by training, tough, practical, not given to dramatic speeches or grand gestures. He simply told his men, "We're staying. We're holding. That's it." But holding Bastogne was becoming nearly impossible. The town sat at a critical crossroads. 7 roads converged there. Every road the Germans needed to continue their offensive west ran through Bastogne. As long as the Americans held it, the entire German advance was bottlenecked. Hitler's orders to his commanders were clear. Take Bastogne. Immediately. The Germans threw everything at it. Artillery pounded the town day and night. Shells fell constantly. Buildings collapsed. Fires burned despite the snow. Civilians huddled in cellars, trapped in the middle of a battle they never asked for. German infantry attacked from every direction. Tanks tried to break through the American perimeter. The 101st had to stretch their lines impossibly thin, defending a circle 7 miles around with barely 11,000 men. And they were running out of everything. Ammunition was rationed. Artillery crews were told, "Fire only at critical targets." Riflemen counted their bullets. Some soldiers had only a handful of rounds left. Medical supplies were gone. Surgeons operated in freezing cellars with no anesthetic. They amputated frostbitten limbs with hacksaws. They treated sucking chest wounds with nothing but bandages and prayer. Wounded men lay in makeshift aid stations, shivering, waiting for help that might never come. Some died not from their wounds but from shock and cold. Food was scarce. The men ate 1 meal a day, sometimes less. Rations meant for 1 meal were stretched to last an entire day. Some soldiers went 2 days without eating at all. And it was so cold. Soldiers who had been fighting since Normandy said Bastogne was worse than anything they'd experienced. The cold was relentless. It seeped into bones. Men stopped feeling their feet. Frostbite was epidemic. But the 101st held. Every German attack was thrown back. Sometimes by concentrated artillery fire. Sometimes by desperate infantry counterattacks. Sometimes by sheer stubborn refusal to give ground. The Germans began to realize that taking Bastogne by force might be impossible. So on December 22nd they tried something else. They sent a surrender ultimatum. 4 German officers approached American lines under a white flag. They carried a formal message typed on paper. It was addressed to the American commander. The message said, "The fortune of war is changing. There is only one possibility to save the encircled USA troops from total annihilation. That is the honorable surrender of the encircled town." It warned that if the Americans refused, The Germans would use their full artillery and air power to destroy Bastogne completely. Civilians would die. Everyone would die. The ultimatum ended, "We await your answer." The German officers waited. The message was brought to General McAuliffe. He was in his command post in the Heinz barracks, studying maps, trying to figure out how to hold on another day. An officer handed him the ultimatum. McAuliffe read it. He looked up, genuinely puzzled, and said, "Ah, nuts." Then he tossed the paper aside and went back to his maps. His staff officers looked at each other. One of them said, "General, they're waiting for a reply." McAuliffe thought for a moment. He said, "Well, I don't know what to tell them." Someone suggested, "How about what you just said?" "Nuts." McAuliffe smiled. He grabbed a piece of paper and wrote one word in capital letters. "Nuts." He signed it. The American commander. The written reply was taken to the German officers. They read it. They looked confused. One of them asked, "What does this mean? Is it affirmative or negative?" The American officer delivering the message said, "It's decidedly not affirmative. If you don't understand what nuts means, it means go to hell." The Germans left. No surrender. The siege would continue. Word spread through the American lines within hours. The men loved it. "Nuts" became a rallying cry. It was defiant. It was American. It was perfect. But morale couldn't hold Bastogne alone. By December 24th, the situation was desperate. The perimeter was shrinking. German tanks had broken through in several places and been stopped only by direct fire from anti-tank guns at point-blank range. Casualties were mounting. The 101st had lost over 1,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. Every company was under strength. Some platoons were down to a dozen men. Ammunition was critically low. Artillery batteries were firing their last shells. If the Germans launched one more major attack, the defenses might collapse. On Christmas Eve, soldiers in Bastogne heard something. A faint sound in the distance. Artillery fire. But not German artillery. This was coming from the south. American artillery. It meant Patton was close. In frozen foxholes, men whispered to each other, "He's coming. Patton's coming." They just had to survive one more day. One more night. And then maybe they'd see Christmas morning after all. December 23, 1944. Morning. For 8 days the Ardennes had been covered in clouds. Thick, gray, impenetrable fog and snow. The weather had been Germany's greatest ally. Allied air superiority meant nothing when planes couldn't fly. The Luftwaffe, what remained of it, could barely operate either. But the Germans didn't need air power. They had surprise, momentum, and the weather protecting them from American bombers and fighters. Patton hated it. He watched the sky constantly, cursing the clouds. His armor was strong, but without air support, every attack was harder, bloodier, more costly. On December 20th, 3 days before the attack began, Patton had summoned his chaplain, Colonel James O'Neill. He said, "Chaplain, I want you to publish a prayer for good weather. I'm tired of these soldiers having to fight mud and floods as well as Germans. See if we can't get God working with us." O'Neill was startled. He said, "Sir, it's going to take a pretty thick rug for that kind of praying." Patton wasn't amused. He said, "I don't care if it takes a flying carpet. I want the prayer and I want it now." O'Neill went to his tent and wrote. The prayer was simple. Direct. "Almighty and most merciful Father, we humbly beseech Thee, of Thy great goodness, to restrain these immoderate rains with which we have had to contend. Grant us fair weather for battle. Graciously hearken to us as soldiers who call upon Thee that, armed with Thy power, we may advance from victory to victory, and crush the oppression and wickedness of our enemies, and establish Thy justice among men and nations. Amen." Patton read it. He nodded. Then he ordered 250,000 copies printed and distributed to every man in the Third Army. On the back, Patton added his own message. "To each officer and soldier in the Third Army, I wish a Merry Christmas. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We march in our might to complete victory. May God's blessing rest upon each of you on Christmas Day." The prayer cards were handed out on December 22nd, as the Third Army launched its attack. Soldiers folded them and put them in their pockets. Some thought it was just another Patton eccentricity. Others took it seriously. They prayed as they marched. They prayed as they fought. And on the morning of December 23rd, something extraordinary happened. The clouds began to break. By midday the sky was clear. Brilliant blue. The sun appeared for the first time in over a week. The temperature was still freezing, but the fog was gone. The snow stopped falling. And the planes came. Thousands of them. American P-47 Thunderbolts. P-51 Mustangs. B-26 Marauders. The entire weight of Allied air power, grounded for days, now unleashed. They roared over the Ardennes in waves. Fighters dove on German columns, strafing trucks and tanks. Bombers hit supply depots and bridges. Transport planes flew to Bastogne and dropped supplies by parachute. In Bastogne, the surrounded 101st Airborne watched the sky fill with parachutes. Red, blue, yellow, white. Hundreds of them. Containers of ammunition, food, medical supplies, floating down like gifts from heaven. Men cheered. Some wept. They grabbed the containers as they landed and tore them open. Morphine for the wounded. Shells for the guns. Food for starving soldiers. It wasn't relief. The Germans still surrounded them. But it was hope. On the ground, Patton's advancing columns saw the planes overhead and knew the tide had turned. The Germans were now exposed. Vulnerable. Every road, every column, every position could be seen and attacked from the air. That afternoon, Patton found Chaplain O'Neill at headquarters. Patton said, "Well, Padre, our prayers worked. I knew they would." Then he smiled, that rare Patton smile, and said, "God damn it, Chaplain. That O'Neill sure did some potent praying. Get him a medal." O'Neill later wrote that Patton was only half joking. Whether it was divine intervention, meteorological coincidence, or just the luck of war, the weather had turned at exactly the moment Patton needed it most. The soldiers believed. They believed the prayer had worked. They believed God was on their side. They believed Patton had somehow commanded the weather itself to obey him. And belief in war can be as powerful as bullets. The Third Army attacked with renewed fury. The air above them was filled with American planes. The Germans were reeling. And Bastogne was now just miles away. December 22, 1944. 6 o'clock hours. The Third Army attacked. 300 American artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously. The sound was a physical force. A rolling thunder that shook the ground. Shells screamed overhead, streaking through the pre-dawn darkness toward German positions. For 15 minutes, the barrage continued. High explosive shells. White phosphorus. Anything that could kill or terrify. Then silence. And then the tanks. The 4th Armored Division led the assault. Their objective was simple. Drive north. Smash through whatever stands in the way. Reach Bastogne. Colonel Creighton Abrams commanded the lead combat command. He was a tanker's tanker. Aggressive. Fearless. His philosophy was the same as Patton's. Speed and violence of action. Abrams Sherman tanks rolled forward through the snow. Behind them came half-tracks filled with infantry. Tank destroyers. Armored cars. Everything the division could throw at the Germans. The first contact came within an hour. Near the village of Bougainville, German positions opened fire. Machine guns. Anti-tank guns. Mortars. A Sherman tank at the front of the column exploded, hit squarely by a German 88mm gun hidden in the tree line. The crew never had a chance. The tank brewed up, flames shooting from the hatches. The column didn't stop. American tankers had learned a brutal lesson fighting the Germans. You don't stop. Stopping makes you a target. You move. You shoot. You keep going. Sherman tanks spread out and returned fire. Their 75mm guns couldn't penetrate German heavy armor frontally, but they didn't need to. They fired high explosive shells into the woods, into buildings, into anywhere the enemy might be hiding. Infantry dismounted and advanced on foot. They moved in short rushes, using the tanks as cover. When they found a German position, they called in tank fire or threw grenades. The fighting was close and vicious. At one farmhouse, American soldiers kicked in the door and found a German machine gun crew. Shots were fired at point-blank range. Grenades exploded in enclosed spaces. When the smoke cleared, everyone inside was dead. German and American bodies tangled together. The village was cleared house by house. It took 2 hours. 15 Americans were killed. Over 50 Germans. And then the column moved on. This was the pattern for the next 3 days. Act, fight, clear, move, repeat. Every village was a battle. Every crossroads was defended. The Germans weren't running. They were fighting for every inch of ground. The Wehrmacht knew what was happening. American reinforcements were driving toward Bastogne. If Bastogne held, if it was relieved, the entire German offensive would stall. Everything depended on stopping Patton. German commanders threw whatever they could into the path of the Third Army. Infantry battalions. Tank destroyers. Even Volkssturm, the German equivalent of a home guard, old men and teenagers with rifles. Some fought well. Some broke and ran. But all of them slowed the American advance. Tank battles erupted in snow-covered fields. German Panzer IVs and Panthers engaged American Shermans at ranges of less than 500 yards. At that distance, tactics didn't matter much. It was a question of who saw who first. Who fired first. American tankers learned to aim for weak spots. Side armor. Rear armor. Tracks. A disabled German tank was as good as a destroyed one. But the Germans had better tanks. Their guns could kill Shermans from a mile away. American crews knew that every time they went into combat, the odds were against them. They went anyway. Sergeant Jake McNeice, a tank commander in the 4th Armored, later described it as driving into hell with a target painted on your chest. His Sherman was hit 3 times in 2 days. Each time he and his crew bailed out, found another tank and kept fighting. On December 23, with the skies clear, American air power joined the battle in force. P-47 Thunderbolts screamed down from above, rockets streaking toward German positions. They hit tanks, trucks, supply columns. Anything that moved. Fighter bombers worked in coordination with ground forces. Tank commanders would radio coordinates of enemy strongpoints, and within minutes, planes would appear and obliterate the target. It was devastating. German soldiers who had survived years on the Eastern Front said they had never experienced anything like the American air assault. The sky itself seemed hostile. Nowhere was safe. But even with air superiority, the advance was slow, brutal, costly. The weather might have cleared, but the cold remained. Soldiers fought in temperatures well below freezing. Hands went numb. Weapons jammed. Men who were hit and couldn't be evacuated quickly froze to death before medics could reach them. Blood turned to ice in the snow. Corpses froze solid within hours, grotesque statues marking where men had fallen. And still the Third Army pushed forward. On December 24, Christmas Eve, the 4th Armored Division was 8 miles south of Bastogne. They had fought through 4 German defensive lines. They had lost dozens of tanks. Hundreds of men were dead or wounded. But they could see Bastogne in the distance. The town was burning. Smoke rose into the clear winter sky. American artillery in Bastogne was firing constantly. The men of the 101st were still fighting. Still holding. Colonel Abrams gathered his officers that night. He told them, "Tomorrow we break through. No matter what it takes. Those men in Bastogne have been holding for a week. We're getting them out." His tankers checked their vehicles. Loaded ammunition. Filled fuel tanks. Some wrote letters home just in case. Chaplains moved through the columns, holding quick services in the snow. Soldiers sang Christmas carols quietly, voices barely above a whisper. It was a strange, surreal Christmas Eve. Men preparing to kill and die, while remembering peace on earth and goodwill toward men. Patton spent the evening visiting forward units. He moved from position to position, talking to soldiers, shaking hands, telling them what they were about to do was historic. He told one group of tankers, "You're going to be famous. Your grandchildren are going to ask you, 'What did you do in the war?' And you'll be able to say, 'I rescued the 101st Airborne at Bastogne.'" Not many men get to say something like that. Just before midnight, Patton stood outside his command post and looked north toward Bastogne. The sky was clear. Stars were visible for the first time in weeks. He said quietly to no one in particular, "Tomorrow, December 26th, The day after Christmas. The day Patton would keep his promise. Or die trying. December 26, 1944. 1645 hours. 4:45 in the afternoon. Lieutenant Charles Boggess, 4th Armored Division, was commanding the lead Sherman tank of a 5-tank column. They had been fighting all day, pushing through German positions south of Bastogne. Now they were on the outskirts of a small village called Eisenhower, less than 4 miles from Bastogne itself. Boggess had orders. Get to Bastogne. Today. No matter what. His tank, nicknamed Cobra King, rolled forward. German machine gun fire rattled off the armor. Small arms fire. Nothing that could stop a Sherman. But behind those machine guns were anti-tank weapons. Panzerfaust. The German equivalent of a bazooka. One hit could kill his entire crew. Boggess didn't stop. He radioed the tanks behind him. Follow me. We're going through. Cobra King accelerated. The engine roared. Treads churned through snow and mud. The tanks smashed through a roadblock, splintering wooden barriers like kindling. German soldiers scattered. Some fired. Some ran. Boggess's gunner traversed the turret and fired the 75mm gun point blank into a building where Germans were positioned. The building exploded. Behind Cobra King, the other 4 Shermans followed. Then came half-tracks carrying infantry from the 53rd Armored Infantry Battalion. They dismounted and cleared the village on foot, fighting house to house. It took 30 minutes to fight through Eisenhower. Brutal, close-quarters combat. Americans and Germans killing each other in streets and doorways. But the tanks didn't stop. They kept moving. North. Toward Bastogne. The road ahead was open. Empty. Boggess pushed the throttle. Cobra King reached nearly 30 miles per hour, as fast as a Sherman could go on a snowy road. In the distance, Boggess could see the town. Bastogne. Smoke rising from it. Buildings in ruins. But the American flag was still flying. At 1650 hours, just before 5 o'clock in the evening, Lieutenant Boggess and Cobra King crossed into the Bastogne perimeter. American soldiers from the 101st Airborne emerged from foxholes. They stared. Some didn't believe it. They had been surrounded for 7 days. Cut off. Starving. Freezing. Dying. And now, a Sherman tank with a white star on its side was rolling into their position. Boggess climbed out of his tank. A paratrooper approached, covered in dirt and blood, his uniform torn. Boggess said, "I'm from the 4th Armored. We're here to relieve you." The paratrooper just stared. Then he smiled. Then he started laughing. An exhausted, half-hysterical laugh. Within minutes, word spread through the 101st positions. They're here. The 3rd Army is here. We're relieved. Men who hadn't smiled in a week were grinning. Soldiers hugged each other. Some cried openly. They had held. Against everything the Germans threw at them, they had held. And Patton had kept his promise. The corridor Boggess had opened was narrow. Only a few hundred yards wide. German positions were on both sides. It wasn't a full relief. Not yet. But it was a breakthrough. Supplies could come in. Wounded could be evacuated. Reinforcements could enter. Bastogne would hold. Within hours, more tanks and trucks poured through the corridor. Ammunition. Food. Medical supplies. Everything the 101st desperately needed. Surgeons finally had morphine. They could operate properly. Wounded men who had been lying in freezing cellars for days were loaded onto ambulances and driven south to field hospitals. Soldiers who hadn't eaten in 2 days tore into rations. Some ate so fast they made themselves sick, their stomachs unable to handle food after days of near starvation. General McAuliffe met with the officers from the 4th Armored Division. He shook their hands. His face was gaunt, exhausted, but he was smiling. He said simply, "Glad to see you." Later that evening, Patton himself arrived in Bastogne. He drove through the corridor in his jeep, flanked by military police vehicles, his 3-star flag flying. He toured the town, saw the destruction, the rubble, the frozen bodies still lying in the streets. He visited aid stations and saw the wounded. Men with frostbitten limbs. Men with shrapnel wounds. Men who had held this town with nothing but courage and stubbornness. Patton met with McAuliffe. He looked the younger general in the eye and said, "You've done a hell of a job. The 101st can now take its place in history alongside the defenders of Thermopylae." McAuliffe, never one for grand rhetoric, just nodded. But Patton meant it. Bastogne would be remembered. The men who held it would be legends. That night, soldiers in Bastogne slept better than they had in a week. The siege wasn't over. The Germans were still attacking, trying to cut the corridor, trying to re-encircle the town. But the crisis had passed. The impossible had been achieved. Patton had turned an entire army 90 degrees in 72 hours. He had marched them over 100 miles through snow and ice. He had attacked on the exact day he promised. And he had relieved Bastogne exactly when he said he would. Military historians would study it for decades, trying to understand how it was possible. How one man, one army, performed what seemed like a miracle. But to the men who were there was no mystery. It was Patton. And Patton did the impossible. Because that's what Patton did. December 26, 1944. Evening. At German 5th Panzer Army headquarters, the reports coming in were devastating. Bastogne had been relieved. The Americans had broken through. The southern flank of the offensive was collapsing. General Otto von Manschufel, commander of 5th Panzer Army, stared at the maps in disbelief. His forces had been within miles of the Meuse River. Within striking distance of Antwerp. The offensive had been working. And now this. An entire American army appearing out of nowhere, smashing into his southern flank. Von Manschufel knew who was responsible. There was only one American general who could move that fast, hit that hard. Patton. The Germans had intelligence on all the Allied commanders. They respected Eisenhower's strategic mind. They feared Montgomery's methodical approach. But Patton terrified them. Because Patton didn't fight by the rules. He didn't wait for perfect logistics or overwhelming superiority. He attacked when you least expected it, where you least expected it, with a speed and fury that was nearly unstoppable. And now he had done it again. Von Manschufel sent urgent messages to Field Marshal Walter Model, overall commander of the offensive. The situation was critical. They needed to divert forces south to stop Patton. They needed to cut the corridor to Bastogne. They needed reinforcements. Model had no reinforcements to send. Every division, every tank, every reserve had already been committed to the offensive. There was nothing left. He forwarded the reports to Hitler at the Eagle's Nest, the Führer's headquarters. Hitler's response was predictable. He refused to accept reality. He ordered Model to attack again. To reinforce the drive toward Antwerp. To ignore Patton. Bastogne didn't matter. The offensive must continue. Model knew it was insane. The offensive had already failed. They had lost the element of surprise. American reinforcements were pouring into the Ardennes from every direction. Allied air power was devastating German columns. And now Patton's Third Army was driving north, threatening to cut off the entire German spearhead. But Hitler's orders were absolute. So the Germans attacked. Again and again. Throwing themselves against American positions with the desperation of men who knew they were losing. On December 27, German forces tried to cut the Bastogne corridor. Panzer divisions hit the narrow American salient from both sides. The fighting was ferocious. For a few hours, it looked like Bastogne might be surrounded again. But Patton had anticipated this. He had positioned his divisions to defend the corridor. More American tanks poured north. More artillery. More infantry. The German attacks were beaten back. On December 28, the weather was still clear. American P-47s and P-51s flew constant missions. They hunted German tanks. They bombed supply columns. They made movement in daylight nearly impossible. German soldiers began abandoning vehicles and walking. Tanks ran out of fuel and were destroyed by their own crews rather than let them fall into American hands. The Luftwaffe tried to intervene. On New Year's Day 1945, the Germans launched Operation Bodenplatte, a massive air attack on Allied airfields. Over 900 German aircraft took part. It was the largest Luftwaffe operation in months. They destroyed several hundred Allied aircraft on the ground. But they lost nearly 300 of their own planes. Pilots they couldn't replace. Aircraft they couldn't rebuild. It was a Pyrrhic victory. After Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe was essentially finished as an effective fighting force. Through January, Patton's Third Army continued pushing north and east. Slowly, methodically, they recaptured the ground the Germans had taken in December. It wasn't the lightning advance of the relief of Bastogne. It was grinding, bloody combat. Every village had to be cleared. Every ridge had to be taken. The Germans fought delaying actions. Rearguard stands. They made the Americans pay for every mile. But they were retreating. The Bulge was flattening. By mid-January, the Wehrmacht had been pushed back almost to their original start lines. The salient that had threatened to split the Allied armies was gone. On January 16, American forces from the north and south linked up. The Battle of the Bulge was officially over. The Germans had lost. Catastrophically. Over 100,000 German casualties. Killed, wounded, captured. Over 800 tanks destroyed or abandoned. Thousands of vehicles lost. Fuel reserves exhausted. Ammunition stockpiles depleted. Hitler had gambled everything on one last offensive. And he had lost. The Wehrmacht would never again launch a major offensive in the West. From this point forward it would be retreat. Delay. Desperate last stands. The road to Berlin was open. And the generals who had stopped the German offensive, who had turned defeat into victory, knew exactly who deserved the credit. Eisenhower sent Patton a message. The speed with which you moved your forces and the skill with which you employed them are truly remarkable. Well done. Montgomery, who had feuded with Patton throughout the war, grudgingly admitted that the relief of Bastogne was a remarkable feat of military logistics. But perhaps the most telling assessment came from the Germans themselves. After the war, German Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt was asked which Allied general impressed him most. He didn't hesitate. Patton, he said. That man was born to command armies. The Battle of the Bulge was over. Hitler's last gamble had failed. And George Smith Patton had secured his place in history. But the cost had been staggering. And the men who paid that cost deserved to be remembered. The Battle of the Bulge was the largest and bloodiest battle American forces fought in World War II. The numbers are staggering. Almost incomprehensible. 19,000 Americans killed. Over 47,000 wounded. Nearly 23,000 captured or missing. That's 89,000 American casualties in 6 weeks. More than the entire population of many American cities at the time. The Germans suffered even worse. Over 100,000 casualties. Killed, wounded, captured. An entire generation of young German men, thrown into a battle their leaders knew they couldn't win. Belgian civilians caught in the crossfire. Thousands killed. Tens of thousands made homeless in the middle of winter, their towns reduced to rubble. But statistics don't capture what war really costs. Numbers don't bleed. Numbers don't freeze to death in foxholes. Numbers don't write letters home that will never be answered. Behind every statistic was a person. A son. A brother. A husband. A father. Private Robert Miller, 99th Infantry Division, was 19 years old. From Iowa. He was killed on the first day of the German offensive, December 16th. His mother received the telegram on Christmas Eve. She kept his last letter for the rest of her life. In it he had written, "Don't worry, Mom. This sector is quiet. I'll be home soon." Sergeant Thomas Hayes, 101st Airborne, survived the siege of Bastogne. He was evacuated on December 27th with severe frostbite. Surgeons amputated both his feet. He was 22 years old. He lived another 60 years, never once complaining about what he'd lost at Bastogne. When people asked him about it, he'd say simply, "I came home." A lot of guys didn't. Lieutenant Paul Kerner, 4th Armored Division, was a tank commander. His Sherman was hit by a German 88 on December 24th. The shell penetrated the armor and ignited the ammunition inside. The tank exploded. Kerner and his entire crew died instantly. He was 24. He'd been married 6 months before deploying overseas. His wife was pregnant. She named their son Paul. The boy grew up never knowing his father. Medic Eugene Davis treated over 100 wounded men during the battle. He worked in a freezing aid station in Bastogne with almost no supplies. He watched men die because he didn't have the morphine to ease their pain. He didn't have the plasma to treat their shock. He didn't have the instruments to stop their bleeding. After the war, Davis never spoke about Bastogne. Not to his wife. Not to his children. He carried those memories alone until he died in 1989. The psychological wounds were often worse than the physical ones. Thousands of soldiers suffered what was then called combat fatigue or shell shock. Today we call it PTSD. Post-traumatic stress disorder. Men who had fought bravely, who had done everything asked of them, came home broken. They couldn't sleep. They had nightmares. Loud noises sent them diving for cover. They couldn't hold jobs. Couldn't maintain relationships. Some drank to forget. Some never could. The army didn't understand it then. There was no treatment. No therapy. Just an expectation that men would tough it out. Be strong. Get over it. Many never did. And then there was the cold. Over 15,000 American soldiers suffered frostbite injuries during the Battle of the Bulge. Fingers, toes, hands, feet, ears, noses, tissue that froze and died. Some lost digits. Some lost limbs. All of them carried the scars for life. One soldier described it years later. People ask me about the fighting. About the Germans. But what I remember most is the cold. The cold that never stopped. The cold that got into your bones and stayed there. Even now, 70 years later, I still feel it sometimes. Like it never really left. The snow in the Ardennes that winter was stained red. Then the red turned brown as it mixed with mud and debris. And then fresh snow fell, covering everything. White and clean and pure as if nothing had happened. But beneath that snow were bodies. American. German. Frozen solid. Some wouldn't be found until spring when the snow melted. Graves registration units worked through January and February, recovering the dead. Identifying them when possible. Many were unidentifiable. Burned beyond recognition. Blown apart. Lost. They were buried in temporary cemeteries. Later, many were repatriated to the United States. But thousands remain in Europe. In military cemeteries in Belgium and Luxembourg. Row after row of white crosses. And occasional stars of David. Each marking a life cut short. A future stolen. The Henri Chapelle American Cemetery in Belgium holds over 7,000 American war dead. Many from the Battle of the Bulge. The Luxembourg American Cemetery holds nearly 5,000 more. General Patton himself is buried there. He died in a car accident in December 1945, almost exactly 1 year after the battle. He requested to be buried with his men. Visitors to those cemeteries today walk among the graves and try to comprehend the scale of the sacrifice. The sheer number of young men who died in a war that ended 80 years ago. But numbers still don't capture it. You have to imagine each cross as a person. Someone who laughed, who loved, who had dreams, who wanted to go home, and didn't. The Battle of the Bulge was a victory. It stopped Hitler's last offensive. It broke the back of the Wehrmacht. It opened the road to Germany. But victory always has a price. And the men who fought in the Ardennes paid it in full. In the aftermath of the Battle of the Bulge, the question everyone asked was simple. What if Patton hadn't been there? What if he hadn't predicted the attack? What if he hadn't prepared contingency plans? What if another general had been in command of the Third Army? Military historians have been analyzing that question for 80 years. And the consensus is sobering. Without Patton's intervention, Bastogne would likely have fallen. The 101st Airborne, surrounded and running out of ammunition, could not have held indefinitely. Within days, perhaps a week, they would have been overrun or forced to surrender. If Bastogne had fallen, the Germans would have controlled the critical road network. Their advance could have continued west. The Meuse River might have been reached. The Allied northern armies could have been cut off from their supply lines. Would the Germans have reached Antwerp? Probably not. Even in the best-case scenario, they didn't have the fuel or the manpower to go that far. But they could have created a strategic crisis, delayed the Allied advance by months, forced a negotiated settlement in the west while Germany concentrated on the Soviet threat in the east. Hitler's plan was insane. But it wasn't impossible. And Patton stopped it. not just by relieving Bastogne, but by doing it so fast with such force that he shattered German morale. He proved that the Wehrmacht could be outmaneuvered, outfought, and crushed by American military power. The Germans never recovered from the Bulge. The losses in men and equipment were catastrophic. But more importantly, they lost something intangible. Belief. The belief that they could still win. After the Bulge, German soldiers knew they were fighting a losing war. They fought on out of duty, out of fear of what would happen if they didn't, but not out of hope. And Patton had done that. For Patton personally, the Battle of the Bulge was vindication. 18 months earlier, he had been in disgrace. The slapping incidents in Sicily had nearly ended his career. Eisenhower had reprimanded him. The press had crucified him. Politicians had called for his dismissal. Patton had been sidelined during D-Day, watching from England while other generals became heroes. But Eisenhower had brought him back. Because Eisenhower knew that when the situation was desperate, when speed and audacity mattered more than caution, there was no one better than Patton. And Patton had proven it. Not just once but repeatedly. Across France. And now at the Bulge. After the battle, Eisenhower sent Patton a personal letter. It said, "I know of no one who could have done what you did during the critical days of December. Your accomplishment will go down as one of the great feats of the war." That was high praise coming from Eisenhower, a man not known for flattery. But perhaps more telling was the reaction of the Germans. After the war, Allied intelligence officers interrogated captured German generals. They asked them to assess American commanders. Field Marshal von Rundstedt said, "Patton was the most dangerous general the Allies had. Fast, unpredictable, aggressive. He attacked when you didn't expect it and he didn't stop." General Gunther Blumentritt said, "We feared Patton more than any other Allied commander. When we heard Patton was in a sector, we knew there would be trouble." SS General Sepp Dietrich, who commanded the 6th Panzer Army at the Bulge, was blunt. "Patton broke us at Bastogne. We could not stop him. He moved too fast." That was the ultimate compliment. The enemy feared him. But Patton's legacy is complicated. He was not a simple hero. He was brilliant. A tactical genius. A student of military history who understood warfare at a level few ever achieve. But he was also cruel. He had no patience for weakness. He slapped soldiers suffering from PTSD and called them cowards. He made racist and anti-Semitic remarks that would be indefensible in any era. He believed in reincarnation, in destiny, in his own greatness to the point of arrogance. He was difficult to work with. He feuded with other generals. He disobeyed orders when he thought he knew better. Eisenhower once said of Patton, "He's the best tank commander we have. But I have to watch him constantly, or he'll start World War III on his own." After the Bulge, Patton wanted to drive straight into Germany. Then into Czechoslovakia. Then, after Germany surrendered, he advocated for immediately attacking the Soviet Union. He said, "We've defeated the wrong enemy. We should have fought the Russians, not the Germans." It was a position that appalled his superiors. Eisenhower relieved him of command of the Third Army in October 1945. Patton was given a ceremonial position overseeing military records. For a man who lived for combat, it was a humiliation. On December 9, 1945, almost exactly 1 year after the relief of Bastogne, Patton was riding in a staff car near Mannheim, Germany. The car collided with a truck. Patton suffered a broken neck. He was paralyzed from the neck down. For 12 days he lingered in a military hospital. He knew he was dying. He told his wife Beatrice, "This is a hell of a way to die." On December 21, 1945, George Smith Patton died of a pulmonary embolism. He was 60 years old. He was buried in the Luxembourg American Cemetery, alongside the soldiers of the Third Army who had died under his command. His grave is marked with a simple white cross, identical to all the others. The only difference is the inscription. George Smith Patton Jr. General 3rd Army. Thousands of veterans attended his funeral. Men who had served under him. Men who had cursed his name during forced marches and brutal training. Men who had hated him at times. But they came. Because they knew. Patton had led them to victory. He had brought them through hell. And more of them had survived because of his leadership than might have otherwise. One veteran said years later, "Patton was a son of a bitch. But he was our son of a bitch. And we loved him for it." Today, military academies around the world study Patton's campaigns. The relief of Bastogne is taught as a textbook example of rapid maneuver warfare. His methods, his philosophy, his aggressive mindset, all are studied and emulated. But perhaps his greatest legacy is simpler. He proved that audacity works. That speed and aggression, properly applied, can overcome superior numbers and firepower. He proved that leadership matters. That one man in the right place at the right time can change the course of history. And he proved that the impossible is often just the untried. When Eisenhower asked him, "When can you attack?" every other general would have asked for time. For more troops. For better conditions. Patton said, 72 hours. And he delivered. That was Patton's genius. Not just in planning. Not just in tactics. But in belief. In absolute, unshakable confidence that he could do what others said was impossible. And in December 1944, that confidence saved the Western Front. 80 years have passed since that frozen December when the world held its breath. The forests of the Ardennes are peaceful now. The villages have been rebuilt. The shell craters have been filled. The blood has long since washed away. But the lessons remain. The Battle of the Bulge teaches us something fundamental about war, about leadership, and about human nature itself. It teaches us that wars are never truly over until they're over. That a desperate enemy is the most dangerous enemy. That overconfidence kills. In December 1944, the Allies thought they had won. Germany was defeated, they believed. The war would be over by Christmas. They had stopped paying attention. Stopped preparing. Stopped being vigilant. And they nearly paid for that mistake with catastrophic defeat. Complacency is always dangerous. In war. In life. The moment you believe you've won is the moment you're most vulnerable. But the Battle of the Bulge also teaches us about resilience. About what ordinary people can endure when everything depends on it. The soldiers who held Bastogne weren't superhumans. They were farmers and factory workers and college students. They were cold. They were hungry. They were terrified. Many of them wanted to surrender, wanted to run, wanted it all to just stop. But they didn't. They held. Because the men next to them were holding. Because they had been given a mission. Because they refused to quit. Human beings are capable of extraordinary things when they have to be. And the battle teaches us about leadership. Real leadership isn't about being the smartest person in the room. It's not about having all the answers. It's about preparation meeting opportunity. It's about being ready when the moment comes. Patton was ready. Not because he was lucky. Not because he was psychic. But because he had studied. He had prepared. He had thought through scenarios that everyone else dismissed as impossible. And when the impossible happened, he was ready to act. Great leaders don't wait for perfect conditions. They act with the information they have, the resources they have, the time they have. They make decisions when decisions are hard. They take responsibility when responsibility is heavy. Patton said, "A good plan violently executed now is better than a perfect plan executed next week." That philosophy won the Battle of the Bulge. And it's a philosophy that applies far beyond the battlefield. In business. In crisis management. In life. Speed and decisiveness often matter more than perfection. But perhaps the most important lesson the Battle of the Bulge teaches us is about the cost of freedom. We live in a world shaped by what happened in those frozen forests 80 years ago. If Bastogne had fallen, if Patton had failed, if the Germans had succeeded, the world today would be unrecognizably different. Democracy might have faltered. Nazi Germany might have survived longer, killed more people, caused more suffering. The world we know, the freedoms we enjoy, the peace we take for granted, all of it rests on the sacrifices made by men who fought in snow and ice and darkness. 19,000 Americans died to stop Hitler's last gamble. They died far from home. Many were never identified. Many have no one left alive who remembers them. But they mattered. What they did mattered. The battle they fought 80 years ago still echoes through history. We owe them memory. We owe them gratitude. We owe them the promise that we will not forget what they endured and what they gave. The last veterans of the Battle of the Bulge are gone now. The final survivor died just a few years ago. No one remains who can tell us firsthand what it was like to be there. To be cold beyond imagining. To be afraid beyond description. To keep fighting anyway. But their story survives. In the history books. In the cemeteries where they rest. In the world they saved. And in the lesson they taught us. That when the moment comes, when everything is on the line, when the odds seem impossible, ordinary people can do extraordinary things. Because they have to. Because someone has to. In December 1944, George Smith Patton and the soldiers of the Third Army did the impossible. They turned an army in 72 hours. They marched through hell. They broke a siege. They shattered an enemy offensive. They changed the course of the war. Not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. That is the legacy of the Battle of the Bulge. That is the lesson of Bastogne. That when the world is dark and the cold is bitter and the enemy is at the gate, there are still those who will stand, who will fight, who will refuse to surrender. And sometimes that makes all the difference.